Hi, and warm welcome to today's webinar on the EPSO Secretaries exams. This is an information webinar, Information Webcast, goes by many names. This is András Baneth speaking live from Brussels. And just to make sure technology works fine, I'd like to ask you to put into the chat box where you are dialing in from. We already have one person commenting. It's from France, from Brussels, Seville, Pula, Rome, all over the place. Excellent. A lot of people from Brussels. Very good. From sunny Brussels. We're lucky with the weather. And even from Luxembourg. Let's see who's dialing in from the furthest away. Cyprus is the winner so far. And Italy, excellent. Romania, from all over the place. That's great. That's so great. I'm so glad to have you here. And as I mentioned before, so this is a live session, but obviously we are recording it, and we'll make the recording and the slides and everything available right after the webcast. It will be directly downloadable or available on our website. And we're also going to do a transcript, so you can read everything that I will say in the next hour or so. So with that, I have Lenke and Veronica helping me from afar, from Budapest, and they are in charge of all technology-related questions. If something doesn't work, try to get in touch with them directly. They will be happy to help, but 99% of the cases, you just restart your browser or use a different browser or a different device, and that should work fine. So with that, I think we should get started. So today we're going to cover everything that's related to the 2020 secretary exams, which were actually announced today. So we are very much on the ball and trying to be very topical by sharing all the information about this competition that you need to know. With that, in the chat box, you can ask questions. Anything that comes to your mind related to the competitions, the methodology of how to prepare, or some technical question related to it, please put that into the chat box, and my colleagues will answer if they can right away. Obviously, I will give my input on any substantive questions. They will convey those to me. Whatever I may not have time to cover, I will come back to you, or we will come back to you writing up a blog post or any sort of follow-up material to make sure that no question remains unanswered. So with that, we're going to get started. And perhaps I'll leave the camera on. It makes it a bit more personal, and you can see me as I talk with my hands. So hopefully that will help in the understanding, but please keep your focus on the slides, and we'll see how that goes. Usually I don't keep the video on, but why not something different for this time? So with that, the notice of competition, as I said, was just published today on the 25th of June, 2020, with all the details and information in it. So that gives us a very specific and very authentic, not just authentic, very reliable source of information that we are sharing with you right now. So that's my background. I will not bother you with that. Hopefully you know a little bit about our company and myself with all the things we put up online. But as I said before, in case you miss anything, you receive everything within a day, the recording, the presentation slides, everything that you see on the screen, and the transcript as well. That will take us a couple of days to write it down, but you'll have that in your inbox as a person who signed up, and even those who might be watching this as a recording, you'll get that. About our company in a nutshell, before we get into the real topic of today. So we've been helping the community of EU exam candidates for many, many years now, and we have around 100,000 users over the many years. We've helped thousands and thousands of candidates prepare for the competitions with success. So there's a huge alumni community of those who prepared with EU training who are now happy EU officials. We have 50,000+ followers, fans on Facebook. So join that community. And there are many thematic Facebook groups that you might want to join, including one for this particular competition, the secretary competition. You can share insights, news, ideas, rumors, updates, success stories with each other in those groups. The test packages are there to help you. So we have a huge database in many, many languages, in 19 languages, with 25,000+ exam questions, and there are over 17 million questions that have been used. It's pretty fascinating. And make sure to check out the webinars. So there's a slide in the very end on the free webinars we put out there, but there are dozens of free webinars you can find on the website to prepare for various aspects, various elements of this particular competition as well, for abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning, and many other methodology webinars as well. And yes, we've trained quite a few participants. And then in the very end, I'll be happy to share with you a special exclusive offer for those of you who are following us live, and even those who watch the recording within 2 days. You'll get that discount code that you can use for all the packages that we offer to help with your preparation. So first and foremost, when it comes to the secretary competitions, where will you work? That might be a question which is a little far ahead because you are still preparing for the competition. You might be dreaming of an EU job, and many of you are already in Brussels, perhaps in different roles, but this is a question you will ask for practical reasons and purposes. The workplace for secretaries in the end is pretty much the same as for any other competition. Typically, it's Brussels, and in quite a few cases could be Luxembourg. Being posted in different locations, so say different capitals around the EU, or being posted outside of the EU is pretty much the exception, which doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It does happen. So you can be posted in the context of the External Action Service. You might be posted in different capitals at EU representations, which are not delegations. Delegations are to non-EU countries, but representations are what we have in all the EU capitals. Interestingly enough, even in Brussels, there's a representation of Belgium towards the EU institutions. So you might end up working there, but as I said, this is pretty exceptional. As a main rule, the place of work will be Brussels or Luxembourg. Just on the map, now you can see that. But perhaps more importantly, you might be asking which institution might hire you in the end. You may or may not have already a preference to work at a given EU institution. This is pretty personal. If you are already at an EU institution in one capacity or another, perhaps working as a temporary or contract agent, and this is something you'd like to pursue as an open-ended permanent contract, which requires you to pass these open competitions. Once you do that, you can be recruited to any of the EU institutions, and in legal terms, the institutions are the ones you see on the screen, which is European Commission, European Parliament, Council of Ministers, Court of Justice, the European Court of Auditors, the Economic and Social Committee, and the Committee of the Regions. So that's where you can end up working. These are pretty different institutions, and that's a knowledge you might want to brush up on to make sure that you know the basics about each of these institutions, as this knowledge might indirectly be helpful in various stages of your competition. Now that I mentioned it, I want to also mention a good resource we have on the website. It's a couple of e-learning courses we made freely available. So my colleagues will link it here into the chat box. You will see that this is about covering which EU institutions are out there, how they work in a nice visual manner, with the only caveat we haven't updated these for quite a few years. So certain numbers and figures may not be completely valid anymore, but it gives you a good baseline understanding about how the EU works. And that is a helpful knowledge for you to have if you are coming from a completely different area or from a completely different sector into the EU world. So with that, let's go on to the next one, which is an important point, that this meaning where you're going to be recruited is only decided at the moment of the actual recruitment. The competition, the one that EPSO organizes, is a selection competition, which ends in a reserve list. So you are placed on a reserve list where you can be recruited from. Which institution takes you really depends on what specific need they have at the moment of recruitment. But each institution has already indicated to EPSO and the selection board how many places they might need by the time when the competition finishes. But this is not something you can decide as a candidate in advance. This is something that you can look at only at that moment, which is possibly 9 months from now, given the time it takes for the reserve list to be established. How many positions are available? This is openly communicated in the notice of competition. So there are 2 grades, something we'll look at more in depth. So there's grade SC1, so Secretary level 1, and SC2, which is a slightly higher grade with a slightly higher salary. There you have a different number of places. So for SC1, as you can see on the screen, there are 328 places, and for SC2, 207. This is amazing. This is probably the biggest secretary competition in 5, perhaps even 10 years. As far as I recall, ever since I've been following EU competitions, I don't recall such large numbers for hiring, reserve list, but eventually for recruitment that they put out there since 2007, perhaps since the latest competition wave linked to EU enlargements. So this is a fantastic opportunity for everyone who's interested in this particular position, all of you, obviously, the very reason you being here on this webcast today. It's, I'm not saying once in a lifetime opportunity, but it's really an amazing, amazing chance given the sheer volume of intake that they foresee. So do apply, give it a chance and see where it takes you, as in future they might do similar competitions, but definitely with lower numbers. And then application deadline, obviously very important, clearly communicated in the notice of competition. It's 8th of September. So there's quite some time until then, roughly 2 months, a little more than 2 months. Make sure you don't leave your application to the last moment. This is a typical mistake. You might think there's just so much time that you can afford leaving it to the 6th of September, 7th of September. A lot of candidates think the same way. Often what happens, servers might break down, there might be some technical difficulties, or you just forget about it and you then miss this opportunity. So whenever application opens, which I believe will be very, very soon, so now that the notice is out, possibly next week or the week after, they would open the application process. You go to EPSO's website and you create a profile and you can start the application process. You may not need to finish everything in one go. You can already upload certain pieces of information and you can conclude it in due course. But do not leave it to the very last moment of the application deadline. A very important question, are you eligible for this position? There are certain objective criteria of eligibility, the ones you see on the screen. It's pretty much you must have an EU citizenship. And of course, this is very tricky for British candidates because they are no longer part of the EU, despite the transition period we're having right now, but they are not EU citizens, so they cannot apply as EU citizens. If they have a second citizenship, of course, that's a big help, but British citizens, just like any other non-EU country, would not be considered eligible. You need to have completed your military service, which in some countries is a non-issue. In other countries, there's a compulsory military service. Often it's for men only, where you need to give some certificate or any sort of justification that you have completed that. And I see here a comment saying that it's open. So actually they have already opened the application. Do not leave this live webinar. Wait until I finish everything. And then of course you can navigate over to EPSO website and get your application started. And then there's a third requirement, which is you need to meet the character requirements for the job. If you have a criminal record or you have some sort of, let's say, moral failing, which some authority has condemned in formal terms, that might disqualify you. Usually this is not a hurdle you may not be able to pass. This is definitely a minor issue for the vast majority of candidates. So these are the three objective criteria. And then you have a couple of other more specific criteria, plus the exams that you need to sit and pass in order to qualify for the next stage. So let's see what those specific criteria are. There are the language rules. What languages can you choose from, and how does it work when it comes to language 1 and language 2? Language 1 has to be one of the EU's 24 official languages, which essentially means any EU official language it qualifies, though there are certain, say, caveats or certain footnotes to this large choice. I often say, if you happen to have, say, Russian as your mother tongue, or Arabic, or any other language which is widely spoken in Europe, but not an official EU language, unfortunately, you cannot choose it as your language 1, despite being your mother tongue. It has to be from among the 24 languages. Could be Maltese. It cannot be Luxembourgish. So Luxembourgish is not recognized as an EU official language. Maltese is. So make sure that the language you pick is among those official languages. Typically, this could be anything really from Greek, from Romanian, Bulgarian, Czech, Swedish, Portuguese, Spanish, any other, even English, of course. And you are free to choose any language. So I'm Hungarian, my mother tongue is Hungarian, but I would be free to choose as language 1, English, for whatever reason. If I think I perform better when it comes to abstract verbal numerical reasoning, accuracy, and organizing and prioritizing, those tests I could do better in English, well, I'm free to do so. The thing is, language 2 has to be English or French and has to be different from language 1. So if I were to choose as a Hungarian, English as my language 1, good for me, but then I'm limited to using French as language 2. So I probably wouldn't do that. I would choose Hungarian first and then English second. So you are pretty free and flexible to choose either, but these are the choices, and especially language 2 is more limiting. It must be English or French. You can fill in your application in any of the EU's 24 official languages, but the language 1 and 2 must be chosen because it determines the language in which you will sit certain tests. So choose these carefully. And if you have the flexibility and liberty to choose either or find a good combination, I suggest you choose a language as language 1 in which you are very good at processing passively any written text, because that will be used for all the computer-based tests in which you need to process, analyze information, and not necessarily actively express yourself. Whereas language 2 needs to be a language in which you're able to orally express yourself in the most sophisticated and fluent way. So when you get to the assessment center, where you need to do 2 role play exercises and 1 interview related to the field, which is being a secretary, that is done in language 2. So if you're really fluent in French, then probably you want to choose that as language 2, as long as you have a matching language 1 to choose from. So that's pretty much it. I see here one question, why German is not included as a second language? And it is one of the official working languages of the EU institutions. Absolutely correct as you say it. And yet, for, I would say, unknown reasons, they chose not to include that. My hypothesis is that for practical reasons, to conduct the assessment center in language 2 and including German among these 2 options would have complicated the logistics of running the assessment center to a great deal. So they decided not to offer that as an option. There have been a couple of court cases around the languages, and let's hope this does not trigger any court case as a result. Probably EPSO has their own lawyers, and they vetted it, and they made sure that everything is legally bulletproof. So this is the situation, but German is not included despite being an official working language of the institutions. I mentioned this point, language 1 and language 2 must be different. You cannot choose English for both or French for both. And then, most importantly, regarding the criteria, the eligibility, what qualifications do you need to have? What formal papers do you need to demonstrate to the selection board to prove that you are eligible? Well, there is a difference between SC1 and SC2. So SC1 is a lower grade, and because of that, you need a high school degree and 3 years of work experience or a relevant qualification. And I'm cheating here and I'm looking at the slide. European Qualification Framework Level 4. So that's a very specific thing for this kind of clerical tasks and duties, the kind of qualification you need to demonstrate, plus 3 years of relevant professional experience. The relevant professional experience, you can often prove that by a letter from your former employer, or if it's entirely clear, from the name of the position that you held for a certain number of years, that you were a secretary or assistant and doing clerical tasks, that is entirely clear. In some cases, it might be a little more difficult because if your job was, say, a manager and your job really included a lot of different kind of tasks, you may need more details to prove that you have the relevant experience and not just any professional experience. So the word relevant is pretty important here. I'll take actually, I'll cover the next slide and I'll take a couple of moments to answer a few questions that have come in the meantime. When it comes to SC2, as I said, administratively speaking, it's a more senior job with a little higher salary. There are a couple hundred euros of difference, around 300 to 400 euros of difference, subject to various other conditions. So whether you have kids, whether you are married or single, there are a couple of other variables, but the difference in salary between SC1 and SC2 translates in a couple hundred euros of salary difference. Also, in terms of seniority, certain tasks may be awarded to SC2 level and not SC1 level, depending on what kind of tasks are required in a given unit. So what SC2 requires you to have, very similar. So secondary education attested by a degree. And instead of 3 years, you need 7 years of professional relevant work experience. And very similarly, it may not be a high school degree, it might be a European Qualification Framework Level 4, so a formal qualification, and similarly 7 years of experience. So the difference is pretty much the number of years of work experience you are required to have, either 3 or 7, which will determine which position you can apply to. So if you meet the 7 years experience requirement, definitely go for SC2. If it's, let's say, if it's more difficult to prove or you're hesitant, say, I have 5 years, but not 7. I'm not sure I can truly justify or prove all the 7 years. You don't want to be disqualified from the competition for lack of 7 years experience. So they rather go for the safe option. Something you can prove is going for SC1 because you're sure that 3 years is definitely something you can demonstrate. This is often a very difficult part because given your background, your professional background, stuff that you've done, certain jobs may be relevant to the competition, others may not be. So rather be cautious and go for something that's relatively sure instead of taking a huge risk and then be disqualified. So this is my sort of conservative piece of advice. It all depends on your individual situation, how that translates into your application. So let me take a couple of seconds and look at my device for questions that Lenken was kind enough to filter for me. So here's one that says, I'm an administrative assistant translator. Can I enter the EU as a secretary, then move to the translators directorate, or I would have to join a second competition to work as a translator? Well, it's the second case. So secretary positions do not require you or even allow you to do translation work. Translators are hired through a different competition, specifically aimed at translators. There, the requirements are relatively similar, but there you also need to sit or do a translation. You need to have different qualifications. The level of difficulty of certain tests is also different. So to answer your question, you can certainly enter the translation directorate, but you can only work as a secretary. If you aim to work in a policy position or aim to work as a translator, that would require you to sit a different competition. And of course, you can do that. You can do that in parallel. You can sit one competition, succeed, start working, and in the meantime, apply for an open competition just like anyone else. Here's another question. What could be the reason for the higher numbers this time? Wish I knew. Unfortunately, I don't have any information on that. It's just probably an increased need for this sort of tasks. That's my understanding. Maybe it's linked to some staff turnover. It may be linked to a couple of contracts expiring. It may be a strong push from trade unions inside the institutions. There could be many explanations. If we hear anything that we can share with you, we'll let you know, but it's pure speculation. Number 3, how long after the closure of the application deadline is the exam announced? Well, 8th of September is the application deadline, as we saw. I would guess that the computer-based tests would be towards the second half of October, perhaps early November. So a couple of weeks, say anything between 4 to 8 weeks, would the computer-based tests be launched, or at least the booking period would start. Now we see how the post-coronavirus situation might evolve, but as it used to be, there are tons of test centers that EPSO has contracted as partners, and you need to book a date and a venue where you sit the computer-based tests. So if you happen to be in Bucharest at the time of the exam, because you're on a job assignment for 3 weeks, you can sit the exam there despite being a Finnish citizen. So this is entirely possible. And even outside the EU, they had a huge network, globally speaking, of many test centers. Now, how that might change because of the coronavirus and lockdowns and all the other measures, we need to see. But as I said, there is a booking period, and then you sit the exam. There are rumors that they might want to try online testing, which you can do basically from home with certain validation requirements, or the test might happen at the same time for everyone. So there are a couple of other ideas floating around. We need to see what comes of those. And then one more question before I proceed. So does passing the computer-based test for AST-SC 1 in 2009 mean I have to sit the test again? Well, if you set another competition in the context of the CAST exam, so the contract agent selection exams, or just a different competition, unfortunately, whatever result you had there has no impact on this particular one. In that case, you need to sign up again, go through the process, sit the test, and go with the flow. So there's no impact of one competition or another, for better and worse. So if you there had a bad result, you can still compensate, or you can still get a much better result at this competition. All right, let's go on with the slide. I know there are a couple of questions there still, but we'll come back to those in due course. And then here is the idea. Why is it a great opportunity? I don't know how much I need to speak to the converted, how much you are already convinced that this is pretty cool and you definitely want to do this. But certainly salaries are pretty attractive. And we actually have a salary, what is it called? A salary simulation tool, salary calculation tool on our website, which is unofficial, but pretty close to the real deal. So you can put there all the criteria. Which country would you be recruited from? So did you live in Belgium 6 months prior to recruitment? That might affect your salary. How many kids you have, if any, are you married? What sort of professional experience you have? That again has an impact, but you can get a rough idea of the salary, which is around 2,800 to 3,000 euros net per month, with health insurance, with a couple of other benefits included in that. And then there are good benefits, just like the one I mentioned with health insurance. There are European schools. If you have children, that you can sign them up according to languages and where you live and different criteria. And then the question, which is probably on everyone's mind, how am I going to get these jobs? How am I going to succeed in the competition? And I can be placed on the reserve list and eventually be recruited to one of the EU institutions. And I see that here was the question about the salary. So as we did a simulation, as I said, it's around 2,800, 3,000 euros net per month, depending on a couple of other criteria on your background or which country you are selected from. So this is something that we will send as a link to this salary calculator in the follow-up notes, or perhaps if my colleagues can pull it up already, they can put that into the chat box so you have it at hand. So going back to this, how to get actually one of these jobs. Well, you follow the application process where you sign up, you declare that you are eligible given those criteria of EU citizenship, military service character requirements, and you choose your languages, language 1, language 2, and then you submit your application. This is pretty straightforward. There is no specific piece of advice I could give other than the ones I already shared with you regarding the language selection. Make sure to do everything by the 8th of September and not to leave it to the last moment. And then comes the real deal of sitting the computer-based tests, the CBT, those exams where you need to really perform well in order to pass to the next stage. What are these computer-based tests? Many of you would be pretty familiar with most of these because EPSO applies this selection method to almost all competitions, though for most competitions, you only have the first 3 exercises that you see on screen, but not the final 2. So the first 3 on the screen is verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, and abstract reasoning multiple choice tests. And I'll talk about them in a nutshell to make sure everyone has a clear understanding what these are. And there are 2 other tests which are pretty specific to secretary competitions. Sometimes they do it for assistant competitions as well, but typically it's for secretary competitions: accuracy and precision, and organizing and prioritizing. So we'll see what these tests entail, even more so because these are very important for the ranking of candidates, of making sure that you are among the top ranked candidates so that you will be placed on the reserve, well, not the reserve list, but you will proceed to the next stage given the results of the exam. And I see here the question, no IT test, no E-tray. Well, there is a sort of an IT test, which is Microsoft Word. So there's not a general IT test. It's very specifically Microsoft Word knowledge test. But that's the intermediate stage, something I'll get back in a few seconds. So what is verbal reasoning? Many of you would know this really well. So verbal reasoning is pretty much you have a text passage on the screen that you need to read very quickly and very thoroughly. And then there are 4, sometimes 5 statements, only one of which is correct. Your task is to find the correct statement. You have 20 questions and 35 minutes. It's just covering on my screen, but from memory, I say 35 minutes, but I can't see the number on the screen, but as much as I recall, that's the time you have. So it's pretty difficult because roughly 2 minutes, or actually less than 2 minutes per question, reading it, analyzing it, processing it, and then finding the correct answer, 2 minutes is not easy. So what you need to watch out for is the kind of tricks that they apply in the 4 answer options. So you have outside information, stuff that wasn't written in the text, but you may know from the news, from friends, from different places, but it's not in the text. So the statement has only need to reflect what was said in the text above. You cannot know or cannot apply outside knowledge in resolving the question. Sometimes there are generalizations. So if they say it typically rains in Belgium versus it rained 2 days ago in Belgium. So watch out for the kind of situations that the test might describe. Sometimes there are facts and sometimes just hypotheticals. So there's a word, say in English, you would have he might have seen it or he saw it. Obviously, there's a huge difference, and these sort of nuances are often applied as a misleading statement among the answer options. And sometimes it's similar wording, it's not synonyms, but words which are close enough, but they mean something different. So that's verbal reasoning. Certainly you can practice a lot, and you should practice a lot. Make sure that you are efficient, you're accurate. And as I said, we have test questions and a huge database of verbal reasoning tests in 19 languages. Pretty great, and something we're really proud of, because these are validated and high quality tests that help you master verbal reasoning under time pressure. That's pretty much the most important point. Most candidates are pretty good at finding the correct answer, but they may have challenges doing that under the intense time pressure that's imposed on you. Next test is numerical reasoning. So you have 10 questions, 20 minutes. So again, this is clearly 2 minutes per question, tiny bit more than for verbal reasoning, but since you need to calculate and you need to look at charts and tables and pretty complex data, and then so data interpretation, find which piece or which cell or which particular piece of information you need to focus on, it takes quite a few seconds. And then you need to do some reasoning, some logical reasoning, do estimation, not necessarily calculation, but estimation. If you already know the answer at this point, fantastic. If you're still a little uncertain, go for the calculation. There's an on-screen calculator that you can use, so you don't need to do mental calculation, but it does help if you brush up on your math skills. We actually have a webinar which is called Math Refresher, exactly for that situation. If you haven't dealt with mathematics or any sort of algebra for many, many years, you can check that out and it will help you brush up on that knowledge. And then the third one is abstract reasoning. This is usually the most dreaded exercise, something that most candidates are really afraid of. It takes a bit of practice to get into the mindset of resolving abstract reasoning tests fast, especially because you have 10 minutes and 10 questions. So it's 1 minute per question, and you need to quickly identify shapes and patterns and find the next one in the line. Entirely possible, but it does require a bit of practice to get into that mindset. And then the two other tests that I mentioned before, which will be used again in this competition. These haven't been used for quite some time in other competitions, but for some reason, EPSO decided that they're going to use this again, or perhaps the selection board responsible for this particular competition said, well, for secretarial jobs, we need to have accuracy, precision, and organizing and prioritizing skills. What are these? Accuracy and precision, you see a chart like the one on the screen, and essentially you need to find the error. It's a very, very simple exercise. What makes it so difficult is that you have 6 minutes and 40 questions. So you need to be super, super efficient. Need to focus and very quickly find the error, inconsistency, and say which line or which item does not relate to the one in the question. So for instance, if you look at this particular chart, you would need to look at line number 4 and say, okay, where is the error? Is it one icon is missing, or some number or figure is not accurate? Is a date a little off or in a different format? Very easy if you have 1 hour or even 30 minutes or even 15 minutes. But doing all of that in 6 minutes is what makes it so difficult. So it's accuracy, precision under an intense time pressure. Luckily, we have hundreds and hundreds of tests like this. You can practice with those and you can really master this. And this is truly important because, as we'll see in a second, the accuracy and precision and the other one, the organizing and prioritizing, you not only need to pass that at a decent score, so you need to get 50% of the overall score, but you need to be among the top ranking candidates in order to pass to the next stage. So you not only need to be good, you need to be among the top ranking candidates. Otherwise, you can pass the test, but you will not be invited to the next stage. So that's where the true competition comes into play. Prioritizing and organizing, somewhat similar test, though the message here is not on, or the essence is not the time pressure, but it's applying a lot of common sense, logic, and, well, organizing skills as you would in your role as a secretary to look at logistical issues, logistical problems. So it's often about different schedules. Let's say you need to organize a trip for your head of unit, and there are different bus schedules and airplanes and trains and whatnot, and you need to find the optimal way of making that happen. Then you need to recognize certain considerations. So if the person says, well, I really don't like traveling on slow trains and I want a fast train and I want first class, but the first class is sold out, you need to find an alternative. So you need to think in a very practical manner, what is the best solution? Achieve the desired outcome, ultimately, based on the instructions you are given in the test. This is a computer-based test. This is a multiple choice test. So again, this is not particularly difficult. What makes it difficult, again, is the time pressure. You have 24 questions and 30 minutes. So you see roughly a little more than a minute per question. It's something you need to be quickly understand. You need to understand very quickly and find the best framework, find the best solution for each. So that's pretty much it. And as I said, abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning have a different scoring, and prioritizing, organizing, and the accuracy have a different one. So to sum that up, you see here, for the numerical reasoning, you need to get 5 points out of 10. So it's a pass mark. And then, lucky you, for verbal reasoning and abstract reasoning, it's a combined score, and you need to have at least 50%. So if you are amazing in verbal reasoning, you get 15 points. And you're really, really bad in abstract reasoning, you get 0 points. You can still pass. So for these 3 tests, you don't need to be among the top candidates. What happens is you just need to pass with a 50% score, and that's it. That's all they need of you. So pass mark is enough. Whereas I'm just looking at what else we put on the slide. You need to reach the pass mark for each test. Yeah, that's clear. When it comes to the accuracy and precision, organizing, prioritizing, so you need to have at least 50%. Fine. But the difficulty is what I described before. You need to be among the top candidates to pass to the next stage. How many candidates? So they say they're planning to invite five times the number of candidates sought for each grade. So the numbers, I don't think we actually calculated those, but given those numbers, so for SC1, you have around 300 odd places. Then for the assessment center, you have usually around the double. So that would be like 600. And then 5 times, so that's around 3,000. If my quick mental calculation is accurate, but something we'll look at in more detail. So quite a few thousand candidates are likely going to pass these tests. And all of those will be invited to the intermediate test. As we said before, there's no more E-tray exercise. Some of you may not even know what E-tray exercise is. Good for you, you don't need to know. Those of you who are more familiar with the EPSO universe would know what I'm talking about, but there's no such test in this particular competition. What we do have is the Microsoft test. So you have the Microsoft Office Word Skills Test. This is not unheard of. They had done previous exams where they tested these skills. So they might show you little icons, what they do in Microsoft Word. They might provide you with problems saying, if you were to print a letter head, or not a letter, like put the address and print that on the letter, what would you need to do in Microsoft Word? And then there are certain ways of formatting the paper, the document, making sure everything is properly aligned. How do you work with documents protected with passwords or with secret documents, and what Microsoft Word capabilities are there? or say there is a certain error message. How do you resolve that and what you need to do there? The good news is we have hundreds of these tests. So we are providing these tools, making it available to all of you. And we're actually going to have even more in the coming weeks. We're adding it to the database. So that's something you can definitely practice through our website. Here, the timing is the following. So you have 50 questions and you have 60 minutes to answer those. And certainly, this is a very important phase. Only those get to sit this particular test who have passed the pre-selection one. So as we said before, those 5 computer-based tests, you get certain scores, they do the ranking, and hopefully on a happy, sunny, or rainy day, you get an email saying, we're happy to let you know that you passed the pre-selection test, and now you can go on to the next phase, and you need to book a time when you sit it, or it might be at the same time for candidates. We need to see how they arrange the logistics. And then what is the pass mark? So you need to have at least 25 out of the 50 points. That's sort of the objective criterion, but then the pass mark is not enough. Again, you need to be among the top, the highest scoring candidates to pass to the next stage, which is an assessment center. So having said that, what is an assessment center? There's a lot to be said about assessment centers. It's basically an in-person series of exercises, most commonly held in Brussels, that you need to perform and showcase certain skills and competencies. So the assessment center is not a computer-based exam, it's in person, and you need to demonstrate certain skills and competencies. How do you do that? You do that through certain tests and exams, which typically happen on a single day. So the assessment center for this competition will happen in Brussels, and it's held in language 2, so English or French. There are essentially 2 exercises. One is a so-called role play exercise, and that's pretty new. Until now, in most competitions, there is a group exercise. You're given a briefing, and then you sit around the table, and you need to have discussions among the group where the so-called assessors, they are sitting around you, observing you, taking notes, and trying to give a score for your competencies based on a certain grid that they have. There's a lot of information we put out there. There's an ebook, there are webinars, there are tips and tricks articles on EU training that you can find about the assessment center. So when it comes to this particular one, you have the role play exercise. There are actually 2 role play exercises where they evaluate different competencies. So in role play 1, you do certain things and they look at your communication skills, your prioritizing and organizing skills, your resilience skills. In the second role play, they look at different stuff, your delivering quality and results, your working with others skills, and more. And then there's the third exercise, which is a field-related interview. So an interview that is related to you being a secretary and your job experience, your background, or certain situations, how you would resolve those. So we provide webinars, we provide in-person classroom training in Brussels, and if there's a need, there's a group, we might even go elsewhere in Europe, and there's one-on-one coaching to help you prepare for this particular stage. So how does the scoring look like, or what does it look like? There are several competencies, and each is worth 10 points. So altogether, you can have 70 points, and you need to have at least 35. And then the field-related interview is really important because that alone is worth 70 points, and you need to have at least 35 points. So altogether, if everything goes well, and why wouldn't it, you score very high and you end up on the reserve list. So that is when you are eligible, you are recruitable to be hired as a secretary at one of the EU institutions. Reserve list, just a few words what it is. It's basically there are a certain number of places on it, which is already communicated in the notice of competition, as we said before. It has a certain validity, typically 1 year. So from the day of its publication, for the next year, you can be hired. And if they haven't hired a large number of people, sometimes they extend the validity of the reserve list. And then ultimately comes the recruitment. So how to get the job at that point? Well, not just at that point, but all the way up until that point, a couple of general yet practical pieces of advice. So practice a lot. Look at it as a sports competition. If you're in good shape, you need to practice perhaps a bit less. If you need to really refresh your math knowledge or abstract reasoning, or just get familiar with accuracy and precision tests, give the time, spend sufficient time preparing, make sure that you are competitive in that competition. So spend a couple of weeks, maybe up to 10 weeks practicing, and make sure that it's regular. It's, again, very similar to sports. If you do a marathon, you're not going to start preparing the day before. It's something that requires regular and very specific and very deliberate practice, that you have a study plan, that you know where your weaknesses are, and then you really dedicate your attention to improving those skills and competencies. There's a methodology to everything. So read up on, check our ebooks, check perhaps my book, the Ultimate EU Test Book, check webinars like this one, tips and tricks articles. There are incredible amount of resources that we've made available, and really understand the methodology in depth. There's a system to it. There are certain shortcuts and good ideas that you can apply to be efficient at test taking. Do not only rely on practice alone, but make sure to understand what have others suggested. What are the best ways to structure my time, or test taking strategies that will improve your performance. And then persistence is really key. That's why perhaps creating a study group or connecting with a couple of your friends who are also in this competition. You might be competitors in formal terms, but you motivate each other. You push each other, and you make sure that you get to the goal even when you don't feel like practicing, or you want to give up, or you just get really frustrated with this whole thing. So do those simulations, and then use all the resources that we put out there, made available. Feel free to ask us questions. I'm very happy to follow up with you, and we have our team and experts. Anytime, just send us an email through the contact us menu or anywhere else. We're happy to point you to some resources or answer specific questions that you may have. And I know that there are a couple of other questions coming in, which I will look at in a moment. But I wanted to just showcase all the stuff that we put out there. Many of this I've already mentioned. Make sure to check those out. There are lots of free resources and sample tests, and many other stuff you can use. Also webinars. So we have this webinar, The Beginner's Guide to Verbal, Abstract, Numerical, Organizing, Prioritizing. Everything is out there. So check those out and use those. There are also other webcasts that I've done over the years, and even more recently during the lockdown, we did a webinar series on different aspects of EPSO competitions. You can find everything on the website, and if not, just get in touch with us and we'll be happy to assist you. So with that, perhaps I leave the discount code on the screen in a second, so you can note it down. I mentioned the Facebook group that you might want to join. So the books, the test book, and here's the discount code. So while I have that up there, I look at the device to check to find out which questions you've asked that I haven't yet answered. So here's one. The fact that this year the competition is named only secretaries and not secretaries clerks will make the CV selection stricter or not? I don't think so. I don't think it will have that sort of impact on the CV selection. It's I think it's worth looking at the notice of competition and the job description and the kind of tasks that you will be required to perform, and that will give you more guidance as to what the selection board might be looking for when they screen the CVs. Here's another one. Although it's not officially allowed, is there a chance to enter as a 50 plus, so 50 years old candidate, or will there be a hidden age limit? Certainly no, well, discrimination or any negative impact when it comes to the EPSO process, so the selection process that I've described, where it might be, and again, I'm not predicting that it will be or that it could be, but where it might be an issue is at the point of recruitment. So once you are on the selection, on the reserve list, and you are recruitable, whether or not this might have an impact on their willingness to hire you if you are 50 years old or more, I honestly don't know. This needs to be seen. And of course, I know this impacts your willingness and your dedication to enroll in the competition or not. But in formal terms, they obviously cannot and they shouldn't have any negative impact based on your age. That would be discriminatory. In very practical terms, however, this might be a more sensitive issue. So that's all I can say at this point. I don't know how this might play out, but I guess you're not the only one. So there are quite a few people who really the full diversity of candidates. But again, in formal terms, they cannot discriminate because of her age. Is EU training making updated tests depending on EPSO requirements? Yes, we're constantly working on updating our database, and we have a pool of experts who are helping us and making sure that everything is fully up to the standards and requirements and the new demands that you need to that you are subjected to in the competitions. So all our database is fully up to speed, so you can practice with the best material out there. I know that on your website we can find test to practice books for tests in Italian. Yes, we have verbal reasoning tests in Italian. In terms of books, I'm not familiar with any. There might be, but you can find everything on the website, even if it's in English, and then practicing in Italian or any other language from the 19 that we offer, you can certainly find it up there. Where can I find CBT, so computer-based tests for Microsoft Word? So we have several hundred already, and we're adding even more in the coming weeks. So stay tuned, and everything is accessible on the website. And then what else? I think I pretty much answered everything. If not, let me know, and I'm asking my team to let me know. But with that, do fire away. And I'm looking at now the chat, if there's any question that still comes in. Can you estimate the period from the end of CBT until the Microsoft Office? So Microsoft Office test is the intermediate test. So if I take a rough estimate, competition, the application period closes on the 8th of September. The computer-based tests of abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning, organizing, prioritizing, and accuracy, these will probably happen towards the second half of October, perhaps mid-November. And then comes the intermediate test. And if everything goes super fast, the Microsoft Office test could happen around December. If things do not go super fast, it might already be in January 2021. So it will take some time before you actually need to practice those Microsoft Office tests. And I saw there was another question here on what about Outlook or different Microsoft applications? Those are not required in the form of computer-based tests. So you're not tested on those very specifically. Yet you might get questions in the specific interview around your ability, your fluency in working with Microsoft Office tools. So they might ask, so what's your experience working with Outlook? What's your experience in handling a complex Excel sheet, whatever it may be? So there could be questions on those, but these are not, it's not at the computer-based test phase. It might be part of the interview. Okay, so let's see, here's one more. Please specify if MA, so Master of Arts and a master's degree or PhD and Blue Book traineeship counts as working experience. Yes, well, master degree, no, it would not count as a work experience because you are studying, you are not performing relevant tasks for the purposes of this competition. So if you have a high school degree and then you pursued a master's degree or a PhD, or you were a Blue Book trainee, I highly doubt that this counts as relevant work experience, unless really you were the university administrator and you were doing clerical tasks while you pursued your studies. But then you were employed part-time or full-time while doing your studies. So the emphasis would not be on you pursuing your studies. The emphasis would be you work part-time as a secretary at the university's admissions office or in the commission in a different setting. So as long as you can prove that work experience, fine, but having or following those studies would, in my view, not qualify as work experience. So with that, I'll probably stop here because the time is up. And I actually didn't say one very important thing, the disclaimer that everything I've said is as accurate as humanly possible, but it's not the official source. The official source is only the notice of competition. The official source comes from EPSO or the selection board, but not from us. Of course, as I said, we do everything in our power to be as accurate as possible. But if you have a very important legal question or whether a certain degree is acknowledged or something like that, make sure to ask the organizers of the competition, EU institutions or EPSO specifically. They will tell you what's the formally, legally 100% reliable information. So with that, thank you so much for listening. This was great fun, and thanks for all the great questions. I hope it was helpful and interesting for everyone else. Get in touch with us if we can be helpful. Good luck for the competition. Really, you need to be very persistent and just very committed to pursuing this. It's really like, well, winning the Olympics may be a bit intimidating metaphor, but it's really winning some important sports competition that you need dedication, advice, support, good methodology, and practice. So with that, thank you so much for being here. It's András Baneth from Brussels. This was the live edition, and hope to see you around. And well, let us know once you have succeeded. With that, thanks Lenka, and thanks Veronica for helping me out. And until the next webinar, thanks.